Assalamu alaikum.
This is the traditional greeting among Muslims. It means, may peace be upon you. My name is Sulaiman Azari, and I was born in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia. I was born to Sufi Islamic parents and was raised as a Sufi. I remember when I was 11 years old, I had traveled to Damascus, Syria with my family. I thought nothing of it, but its beauty resonates in my mind, where Mediterranean houses stack up on Mount Qasioun, and narrow winding streets where only jeeps and trucks were able to drive up lay between. I remember standing on the rooftop of the house we were staying at and looked down over this incredible mountain, where the square roofless houses descended like a mosaic and the green-lit mosque sparkled like trees in Manhattan. I have one particular memory from Damascus that came back to me very recently. I remember being in the Zawiya, which is a Sufi center where the maqam, or a shrine of a Sufi saint, stood. I remember a tiny green-lit room with floor cushions lined up along the walls. The most humble and harmonious music were being sung and played from flutes and drums. As I stood there sipping on warm mint tea, I remember looking up as a confused and innocent child and seeing two men spinning in sync to the music playing. They were as graceful as ballerinas and appeared to be in a form of serene meditation. They were whirling dervishes. At 15, I moved to boarding school in Edinburgh, Scotland, a school where I attended chapel every morning because I moved away, because before I moved away, I made a decision to leave behind this identity of mine, for the ongoing wars in the Middle East and the rise in Islamic extremists and terrorists left me ashamed. Even though my parents had shown me a side of Islam where there was an importance of love, of music, of poetry, of beautiful architecture, and of peace, it was a side of spirituality and unity between oneself and religion. A week ago, I flew to Istanbul with my girlfriend, where bombing occurred around 500 meters where we were. I saw how easy it might be to pick up on patterns and trends and formulate generalizations, to think that fear is natural and not manufactured. I saw how easy it is to accept stereotypes and reject differences that are both cultural and societal. The next morning, we drove into the Turkish countryside for breakfast in a little wooden cabin flanked by trees and farmland. As we sat there, a certain familiarity loomed over me. I looked up only to see a whirling dervish and heard the very same music as I did in Syria 9 years ago. At that moment, I saw that despite all the destruction and terror from a corrupted minority, the core of beauty and peace and culture remained. I realized that for a lot of us, religion is a form of identity, a sense of home, a sense of family, and an oceanic sense of eternity. Later that day, I asked my girlfriend, who is Jewish and has expressed her fears in Islam about whether I should be open to the fact that I am Sufi. And she told me, tell people I'm Sufi, but that doesn't mean I'm a terrorist. Tell people I'm a Muslim, but that doesn't mean I'm different to you. So whether you're a Jewish, Christian, Buddhist, Muslim, Hindu, atheist, whatever faith you might believe in, let us not crawl back into our cave of projected generalizations, but rather make a conscious effort to see differences in religion and race as nothing more than mere variation, for beneath its surface lies a cultural beauty of equal importance, all rooted from the same tree.
One of my most vivid memories comes from when I was in the 3rd grade. I was at a tennis summer camp, and it's the first time I can remember being dehumanized. I was hanging around two boys, let's call one Adam and the other Brett. And Adam asked Brett, can you come over tomorrow? And Brett responded, I can't, I'm busy. Eager to make a friend, I jumped in and said, I'm free tomorrow. And the boy turned to me and said, you can't come over. And I said, why not? And his response was the first of a series of dehumanizations I would face based on my religion and the place that I'm from for the rest of my life. He said, you can't come over because of what's going on in the Middle East right now. It didn't matter that I was just a little kid who liked Legos, Star Wars, and ate a lot of hummus at home. All that mattered to him was that my name was Ismail and that I was an Arab. Everything that I had accumulated in terms of experience, thoughts, hobbies had been reduced because of who I was. Even in a place like NYU or anywhere where I find myself accepted, I realize that I'm a face of this culture, as not many people have interacted with an Arab before. especially in America. And I'm an ambassador for the language, the food, the culture of my region and religion that many people have only read about. I give a face to the rich history of my people, and whether or not I like it, I'm a diplomat. And I urge you all to assign faces to what you have only thought of as things on paper. That is where xenophobia falls apart, when we start feeling empathy. Thank you.
I'm a little bit shorter than them, sorry. In thinking about the current refugee crisis and rising Islamophobia, I wondered if there was any perspectives we could take away from past knowledge to aid us. I found an extremely interesting comparison to the crisis today with the TPs of the Holocaust. In both instances, a long history of religious xenophobia was the strongest obstacle against obtaining a safe place to live and obtaining citizenship in a new country. I can sympathize with this difficulty as I am the grandchild of a Holocaust survivor. With the Jewish population, many were scared because of the current threat of communism at the time, just as many people are scared of Islamophobia because of radical groups that don't represent Islam correctly. In the case of the Jews, many were allowed to immigrate to Palestine, which was eventually turned into Israel. However, xenophobia against the Jewish people didn't stop after the creation of the State of Israel. It is through the assimilation and mixture of both Western and Eastern culture that will allow us to understand each other and accept each other. In the same manner, Islamophobia cannot be combated by barring refugees who are just trying to make a better life. I invite all of our panelists to speak about this comparison and how we can utilize it to combat Islamophobia and xenophobia today so we don't repeat history's mistakes. In saying this, our first panelist is Cihan Tekeli. He has been working since 2009 as an educator in the fields of the Holocaust and anti-discrimination at the Anne Frank House in Amsterdam. He is also one of the founders of Mo and Moos, a network of Jewish and Muslim key figures in Amsterdam. Please welcome him.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone, also in front of and behind the scenes for making this beautiful event happen. And thank you, NYU, for the invitation to be here. I'll be speaking a little bit about what we do as the Anne Frank House, what our educational approach is, and from there on move to my thoughts and views on the topics introduced. Anne Frank's father, Otto Frank, founded the Anne Frank House in 1957 in Amsterdam with the primary aim to preserve the hiding place and spreading the message of Anne's life and ideals. Otto Frank envisioned a place where people, particularly youth, could meet and interact with one another. In his own words, what happened we cannot change. The only thing we can do is learn from the past and realize what discrimination and persecution of innocent people mean. In my opinion, it is the duty of every one of us to fight against prejudice. Otto Frank. Anne Frank is perhaps the most well-known victim of the Holocaust, yet she was not only a victim, but also a member of a family, a daughter, a sister, a friend. She was also a gifted writer. Anne Frank was an innocent child, a young child persecuted only because she was Jewish. Some of you probably know the quote by Dutch Holocaust survivor Abel Hersberg, who said, "There were not 6 million Jews murdered, there was just one murder, 6 million times." To get beyond the figures and the atrocities, it is important to emphasize personal stories and stories and faces of people. How life was before the war, the voices of the victims during years of persecution, and post-war life of survivors all bring home the lessons that the Holocaust is a history of people. The murder of millions of Jews and other victims, Roma, Sinti, homosexuals, disabled people, political opponents, Slavs, was carried out by other human beings like you and me. To explain the complexity of the Holocaust, the events need to be thought from multiple perspectives. People may have been victims, perpetrators, helpers, or bystanders, but their roles were not necessarily static. Positions could shift because of the choices people made. In history, as today, people are responsible for their own choices. During the Holocaust, people were faced with dilemmas that we can't easily imagine. Choices were multifaceted, and the consequences were not always evident. And of course, everyone did not have the same scope for action. Some of the victims' options can be characterized as so-called choiceless choices. Though learning about the past doesn't necessarily create better people, nor does learning about the Holocaust serve necessarily as an antidote to prejudice and discrimination. However, people who are encouraged to look carefully at histories like the Holocaust and engage in a critical thinking process can be made aware of the dangers of hatred and the need to consider in what way prejudice and discrimination play a role in our world. Philosopher George Gadamer once wrote that when looking at history, we apply projection and actualization in a cognitive movement from the past to the present. This is our way to comprehend history. Events in a different time or place can make sense and become meaningful only through active personal bridging. One bridges over the distance of time, place, culture, and other factors by associating the unfamiliar with the familiar. When our ways of life trap us into a closed world of friends who look or believe like us, elaborating great and beautiful philosophies of tolerance and pluralism is a highly virtual petition of generosity, a subtle way of avoiding the need to be open-minded. Those are but good intentions that amount to making a show of being an anti-racist in intellectual terms. Being opposed to anti-Semitism or Islamophobia whilst living at a distance from Muslims and Jews is certainly an honorable intellectual stance. But basically it tells us nothing about the real personal attitudes of the human beings who theorizes in that way. Ghettos have their own characteristics and consequences, be they physical, social, intellectual, or mental. Those who live in them always nurture projections of themselves or to the world around them that are more imaginary than true. Facing up to and handling diversity requires us to abandon our high-minded theoretical and idealistic notions and to plunge into real life. It requires us to free ourselves from the ghetto of our noble, secure mind in order to enter the world of raw, tenacious, and sometimes mad and dangerous emotions. It requires us to move from the controlled order of the mind to the chaotic tensions and disorders of the heart and the entrails, the so-called guts. Living with and meeting the other, with their differences in terms of skin color, dress, beliefs, customs, habits, psychology, and intellectual logic, refers us back to ourselves, to our inner horizons, and to our subjectivity. Our minds do not control everything. Our certainties and habits may be merely unsettled, but our emotions too react and express themselves. Away from our lounges and our lecture halls, they can easily take possession of us. The other, or the so-called others, and all their visible and or supposed differences reveal both the light and the dark dimensions of our humanity. When the so-called others seem to be confident and serene when we ourselves are unsure of our truths, when their visibility disturbs our living space and their presence upsets our habits, when they seem to steal the few jobs available, when their prosperity reminds us of our difficulties or even poverty, then they stir up within us emotions that are to human beings what survival instinct is to animals. The reaction is almost uncontrollable. All our fine words become meaningless, and we are back to our raw humanity. We have to come to terms with emotions, dispositions of the heart, and this gut reactions that colonize our minds with fear, suspicion, rejection, and prejudice. Purely intellectual racism is a minority and often marginal phenomenon. This is not a matter of justifying or minimizing racism, intolerance, and xenophobia, but rather a matter of understanding where they come from, how they develop, and how finally they can be fueled and instrumentalized. The strength of populist discourses that reject the other lies precisely in their ability to arouse and touch upon raw emotions, fears, and the so-called guts, and to provide them with simplistic reasons and explanation to complex questions. When it comes to the relations between free and equal human beings, appeals for the tolerance of others are no longer relevant. When we are on equal terms, it is no longer a matter of conceding tolerance, but of rising above that and educating ourselves to respect others. This requires a very different intellectual and emotional attitude. It begins with the recognition that the presence of the other within my own conception of the world is both a fact and a necessity. Pluralism is a precondition for humility and a defense against potential excesses. Unfortunately, too often dialogue consists in talking and never in listening. The other is the privileged field for my proselytism. My truth has become a blind and blinding passion. It imprisons me when it should set me free. An act of reason is therefore necessary, first of all, to teach us to become reasonable. Recognizing the diversity of paths and the equality of all human beings are the two preconditions for the respect that allows us to get beyond the power relationship, characteristic of relations of tolerance. Though we also need an intellectual disposition, respect implies an active and proactive attitude towards others, rather than a passive one. We have to be curious about the other's presence and being, and try to know the other once we have learned to recognize them. Recognition, active curiosity, and knowledge introduce our intellects and hearts to the world of the complexity of others. We begin to gain access to their principles, hopes, tensions, and contradictions. Tolerance can reduce the other to a mere presence. Respect opens up to us the complexity of their being. At the same time, it teaches us to recognize that the other is as complex as we are, our equal, our mirror, our question. Reason thus brings us back to the path of the heart. The path of tolerance ends as the mind becomes more resolute. The way of respect is the key to a heart that is open, and yet nothing can ever be taken for granted. Rejection, intolerance, xenophobia, individual and institutional racism, missionary proselytism, the temptation to colonize, truths that are not open to debate, and collective impassioned and even hysterical and deaf passions will always pose a threat to people rich and poor, and to societies. Human beings will never be totally safe from this dark side of their humanity. The spiritualities, philosophies, and religions that have been present throughout history are there to remind us of these fragilities, these vulnerabilities, and these dangers. There are so many reminders on the way, and their own excesses must also be there to remind us. We have to watch the world and watch ourselves with the humility of those who know that learning to become human is a process that never ends. Learn to listen, and to listen to ourselves every day, always. And always recall one truth: nothing can ever really be taken for granted, neither respect nor love. Thank you.
Many of you probably already know our next panelist, Imma Vitelli. She's an Italian journalist for Vanity Fair and has been covering the Middle East for almost a decade. Ms. Vitelli strives to humanize Muslims and Arabs in her stories and avoids the sensationalism that runs rampant among her peers. How the media portrays a group can very frequently affect the public perception, which Imma has been working to fight. She's a spokeswoman, a leader, and above all, an inspiration. Please give a warm welcome to Imma Vitelli.
Wow. I promise I didn't pay him. Hi. Are we awake? You guys are asleep. I need you awake. Hi. I'm happy to be here. Yeah? I'm going to talk about sex. Sex. Are you awake? Sex and Prejudice in Cologne. Some of my students might have already heard the story, so you're entitled to fall asleep. But basically, I'm going to take you back in time to Cologne, 31st of December 2015. It's 10 p.m., then 11 p.m., then it's midnight. We don't know anything. I'm not getting any breaking news. Then it's 9 and 10 and 11. Later, a friend of mine, a colleague from WRD, the public broadcaster in Germany, told me that at 11 at night, he called the police. The police said, "We're having a very nice evening." Eventually, in police reports, we would find out that that fateful evening, the police was asked whether it was in need of reinforcement, but actually at 11:30, the police said, "No, everything is under control. You can go home. No need for reinforcement." By now, you should know what I'm talking about. On New Year's Eve, 2015, in Cologne, in a square by the cathedral and the train station, which is the heart of Cologne, Germany, Europe, hundreds of women were apparently assaulted, groped, harassed, molested. The weird thing about this story that was very sketchy since the beginning is that we didn't know anything about this until the 5th of January. Again, we're in Europe, we're not in Syria. Nothing came out. German colleagues told me, that the police just didn't say anything. The police were saying, "We had a nice evening." So what happened? The reason why there is only this picture, and I'm a bit embarrassed because it's the story of my magazine, it's the story that I wrote. It's because it's virtually impossible to find pictures of New Year's Eve on a main square in Cologne in 2015. That's very strange, right? I mean, we have videos and pictures all the time. I mean, Brussels on Tuesday, you know, we've got the videos and the pictures. We were there instantly, immediately. Now we have hundreds of people, young people, you know, with lots of mobile phones, getting drunk and just harassing hundreds of women. There's not one single picture we could use. So that's the opening that we had to use. It's the morning after. It's a clean square. And that's a train station. Now, I'll take a step back because Cologne is very important because it basically represented a turning point in the refugee crisis in Europe. A very brief step back, very, very briefly. Syrian crisis, war, half of the population was forced to flee Syria, half of the population, we're talking about 10 million people, you know, a refugee crisis. They die crossing the sea, they arrive in Greece, then bang, September comes, and there is a little boy, we don't care, more or less, let them drown, just no one reacts. Europe doesn't have a policy, doesn't have a united policy. Then comes September, there is this little boy drowning in a beach in Bodrum with mother and brother, Aylan, you know, we know everything about him by now. This little boy just triggered an enormous emotional reaction, and in the end, Angela Merkel of Germany, the chancellor, basically decided to open up Germany and to welcome thousands of refugees. So this is the background, okay? 2015, Germany, I think, has welcomed something like 1 million people. We have Ramy, who is with us from Syria, will tell us eventually. So after that, this is September 2015, we have, of course, November the 13th in Paris with the attacks. And every time we have an attack on European soil, you know, there is a very, very visceral response, of course, emotional, of course. And then xenophobic parties use this to say that, you know, we should shut the porters, deport all the Muslims, possibly, you know, deport all the refugees. And you know the spiel, you know the message by now. So this is Paris, November 13th, and Angela Merkel is dealing with the crisis, you know, she's doing fine, and then comes Cologne, New Year's Eve, January 31st. So by the time I get there, I'm feeling like it's very sketchy. I'm talking to my colleagues, and they're like, you know, we don't really understand what's going on. The police chief was forced to resign like a week later. He wouldn't, you know, he thought he didn't do anything wrong. The witnesses, even the girls, they're saying, yeah, there was this kind of gauntlet that they had to run to get to the train station. There were all these intoxicated young people, and it's very, very weird because they're saying that the police actually were not accepting their charges at the beginning. So I'm there. I'm flying eventually there. Most of the foreign press never makes it to Cologne. They all reporting the story from Berlin, which is strange too. I mean, everything was fogged at that point. Everything became politicized. Newspapers were writing stories about, you know, the fact that Europe was importing rapists. So the Muslims were no longer Aylan, the little boy, on that beach in Bodrum. Muslims were now rapists who were going to attack not only our freedoms, but also our women. That was the kind of thinking, you know. Some feminists were launching campaigns and petitions to go to Cologne for carnivals to protect the women. It was a little bit insane. So I arrive in Cologne, and I'm just like, I was like, where are the facts? You know, this is all the politics, but where are the facts? What happened? You know, sometimes you just lose track of the facts because there's too much political manipulation. And so the number one question that I asked was, what happened? And why the German media, the traditional media, did not report on this until January the 5th? Let's go back to the ABC, right? What happened? So my colleagues are basically saying, you know, we don't know what happened, but the police is denying, the police saying, forget it, it was under control, we were overwhelmed. The police was basically lying. The police was not really saying what happened. At that point, at the very beginning, they had 62 charges on the 5th. By the 15th, they became 516. And Pegida, the xenophobic movement, was all over. So the second question, the number two questions that I asked, okay, so police is lying, doesn't say. Colleagues are saying they didn't cover this because the police didn't say anything. There are no pictures. I interviewed the victims. The police wouldn't talk to me. I interviewed victims, and they're like, it was difficult to get train station. There were a lot of drunk men. We got into the train station. There were more drunk men, North Africans, Arabs, Germans, you name it. We went to the police would not accept charges. In the meantime, all over the place, this was the story about Islam, a young Muslim man that could not live in our midst, while we really didn't know what happened. Basically, in the end, I wanted to know how this started, how it became viral. So I asked my young interpreter, my German fixer, like, can you please find out on social media what happened? And she was really good. She basically went to the source. She found on Facebook a guy who on January the 5th posted a video. Again, there are no pictures, no nothing of the victims, nothing. A video of himself. This is a bouncer who was nearby the train station and the cathedral, a bouncer from Croatia, a refugee himself. He had fought the war in Croatia in the 90s. And in this video, he basically starts pointing the finger and saying, we welcome them in our train station with flowers and waters, and look at what these Arabs and North Africans are doing to us. That video went viral. It was seen by 1 million people in a few hours, 5 million people in 5 days, and that was the day when the traditional media started covering the story, not quite knowing what to report on. I interviewed this bouncer, and he was Pegida. He was basically a guy who was Pegida. So the first question I asked him was like, okay, so did you go to the train station? Did you give them water? You know, did you welcome the refugees? It's like, no, of course not. I was against them since the very beginning. It was very difficult to find this in the story, you know, the political manipulations. Then facts. Let's go back to the facts. Okay, so who were these guys? And I have to conclude. Who were they? The North Africans, the Arabs. This was the label that was dancing day after day after day in the media, all over, newspapers and televisions. I think on January the 8th, the police released a list of suspects. The first suspects, 32. 9 Algerians, 8 Moroccans, 5 Iranians, 4 Syrians, 1 Iraqi, 1 Kurd, 1 American, and 3 Germans. This was the first original list, 32 people. There were maybe 300 people that night. 1 million refugees arrived in Syria in 2015. Thank you very much.
Our next panelist is Ramy Al-Asheq and his publisher. And Ramy is a Syrian-Palestinian journalist and poet living in Cologne. He is the editor-in-chief of the Arabic language newspaper Abwab. Abwab directly translates to doors, and Asheq's newspaper is distributed among migrants who have recently arrived in Cologne to give them information about the culture that they're entering in, as well as news. Thank you.
Hello, everybody. Federica Gaida, and her editor-in-chief. So she will start, please.
Hello. So, diverse voices in the publishing world is the name of the speech, I suppose. I represent New European media. I'm a publisher. And at the height of my publishing career, we were publishing 13 newspapers in 11 different languages in Italy. This is where we started, in Italy. The publisher was called Stranieri in Italia. On the strength of the success of that editorial model, we opened newspapers in the UK, focusing on Eastern European migrants, and now in Germany, where we came to the attention of the international media thanks to Abwab, the first German media in Arabic for Arab communities, with a focus on refugees, but not only. Now, the single most common criticism that I have received during these 15, 16 years is, why don't your readers speak in Italian or in English or now in German? Why are you writing a paper in Arabic instead of German? You are not fostering integration in this way. You're fostering difference. Well, no, I do not agree with that. I have a different point of view. So let's take a look at what cultural integration is all about and how it occurs. Now, interaction between cultures is essential for cultural progress. As the development of a child, of an individual as a child, consists in a shift from a level where the world is all about the child, is all inside the child, to a level where the child exists in the world. Cultural progress cannot be activated without entering in a dialogic contact with other cultures. Contact with other cultures allows me to have a critical outlook on my own culture. It allows me to stop considering my values as universal and to consider other ways to confront universal human themes, concerns. Other cultures are an invaluable treasure because they offer unique solutions to universal human concerns. They are solutions that are found in circumstances that we have never experienced, in war, in discrimination. And they are influenced by manners and religions that are entirely different from our own. Now, the universally human is found everywhere in the world. And what we need is to be able to bring into our culture other, original, unique ways of facing these themes. Intercultural policies should focus on achieving access to different cultures. Now, how do we do this? And specifically, how do we achieve access to these new cultures that are coming into our countries, into European countries, with the new flows of migration and the new flows of refugees? Now, there are different models of interaction between culture. One of them is assimilation. So you're coming into our country, forget where you come from, forget your values, because I'm not saying that they're wrong values. I'm just saying that they're not ours and thus they're not important. I don't want to think about your value. You don't exist. Come into our country and learn our values because our values are important. Learn our language, and if possible, forget yours. That is one model, assimilation, acculturation. It's a passive model, and it does not allow anyone to gain from coexistence of cultures. The other model is a ghetto model or an isolation model, where, yes, the minority culture protects its specificity, and it will not be engulfed into global culture, but there's no fruitful interaction between cultures. Finally, there's cultural integration. To create a more complex and enriched culture, we cannot just have a coexistence of autonomous cultures and traditions, but the dominant culture, the integrating culture, must, maintain its own identity, enrichen itself by exploring diversity. Think of the Arabs and the Arab culture, not now, but in the 11th century, in the Middle Ages, how the Arab culture influenced Spanish culture and indeed European culture. We are different because of our coexistence and our interaction with Arabs then, and it's an opportunity for us now. What about refugees? How are we interacting with refugees? Very often, refugees, migrants, and those who should be new citizens in our countries are forced in a corner and pushed to choose between what we can call cultural malinchism, that means a blind adoption of values, themes, and language of the host country, or isolation. So they refuse Western values and they glorify their origin, their traditions, and their religion. And this often leads to the refusal of democratic values, of our values, okay? Conflicts, in this case, stays alive when people do not feel acknowledged and their voices are not heard, their points of views are not recognized. Humiliation it creates anger and frustration and accumulates. And this leads us to where we are now. We are cultures that are living next to each other. We don't understand each other. We don't see each other. So what is our solution? What is our proposal as a publishing company? Is to give voice to these incidents, to these points of view. And that's how we started with Abwab.
According to this voice, we are a voice, but we are not the only voice for refugees, because it's necessary to clear this, because we came from somehow dictatorship countries, and we try now to propose ourselves as an undictatorship. So Abwab is one of the voices of refugees. We are trying to see or to talk about what we think about this kind of new culture or new country which we live in. Somehow we are trying to build a new leadership, political leadership in this kind of new life. And it's so hard, it's not so necessary to talk about it, because in a way, we have really complicated relationship between us and the government, and between us and the policemen also. So once I was in demonstration in Cologne against the Al-Asheq regime, and then the policeman came to us to ask us for a permission, which is with us also. But when I saw the policeman, I just ran away. This is my knowledge about policemen, about uniform, about whatever. So in this way, it's necessary to talk against, for example, the integration system, or against whatever, to have an opinion, political opinion in the new community, in the new host community. So in this way, we could have a good integration, because what we have now, it's not integration. Like, we have somehow from the government and from NGOs teaching for this kind of refugees who came from jungles and they don't know anything about the life. There's, for example, brochures who are explaining for refugees how they could go to toilet, and there's videos. They are trying to say, here in Germany, if women get sick, she could go to the doctor. So in this way of teaching with the stereotype, with a lot of ready image already made before, we will not have integration. The integration should exist on 3 levels or more, maybe. The first one is the knowledge. The second one is affecting and affecting back, and learning, teaching, like to add and to have back. And the third one, which the most important in my opinion, is the respect. And the respect, it doesn't mean ignoring, no, at all. Respect means that you should protect the other rights to be different. Thank you.
Our next panelist is Debora Spini. She's a political theory professor at Syracuse in Florence and a social philosophy professor at the University of Florence. Please give her a warm welcome.
Okay, it is a great pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I'm sure that quite a number of people in this room, they say, oh no, more, even in the afternoon. Yes, even in the afternoon. This is going to be a lot of images, and strange enough for me, not so many words, because what I would like to present are, in fact, a few minutes on this topic, Islamophobia, and we all know what it means. But I would like to look at this rampant Islamophobia here in Italy from a specific perspective, that is a perspective of gender. And the person that spoke just before me, you did mention stereotypes. So this is a great deal about stereotypes. The first thing that I would say is, essentially, these are like the 3 basic points. As you can see, the title of this, not even presentation, but I would say of those scattered thoughts, let's say, is women bodies as battlegrounds for identity conflicts. But sometimes, besides battlegrounds, they also become playfield, because very often they're actually manipulated and strumentalizzati. They are turned into instruments for another political game. So I would like to just present you a couple of images that can help us to see how does gender becomes an integral part in the Islamophobic discourse in Italy. And as a kind of, background concept is, of course, the creation of this semi-mythical creature that is the donna musulmana, as the other with a capital O. The first thing that I would like to say, and I promise I'm going to be brief on that, is also to make a short comparison with the past. Because in fact, if we look, there has been like a shift, if you want. Because if you look, for example, to 19th century, but I mean even 18th century visual culture or poetry, we can see that for the Europeans, the donna musulmana, the Muslim woman, was first and foremost the Oriental woman. And this woman was, in fact, a kind of a creation of a masculine glance, was a kind of, how can I say, epitome of masculine ghosts of desire, and in synthesis was like a symbol of sexuality and sensuality. And it would also be interesting to see that very often the Muslim woman, the odalisca, very often in early European feminism becomes a kind of, negative term of comparison. For example, John Stuart Mill says, we want companions for us. We don't want Oriental odalisca. So somehow the Oriental woman always had like this tinge of, negativity. It was a negative paradigm. It's interesting to see instead that at least, for what you can say in Italy, invece, the donna musulmana, the Muslim woman, becomes a symbol of submission, becomes the symbol of intolerance, becomes the symbol of sexual repression. This is, as you know, the grande odalisque. Vedete, here we have the Oriental woman, and this Oriental woman has a veil, but in this case, the headscarf becomes like a way to underline her sensuality. Even better, this photograph from the early 1920s. And here again, vedete, this is Bridgman, an American painter, as a matter of fact, that describes the harem. And in fact, the harem becomes like, a jewel box of sensuality. E invece today, we can say in contemporary Italy, the body of the donna musulmana, of the Muslim woman, has become like a battlefield for an identity conflict. It is always rephrased as essentially oppressa e schiava, enslaved and oppressed. The Muslim woman is always narrated as victim. Somehow to this woman is denied the possibility of an autonomous agency, and especially it is always represented as the target of violence. This, I would say, I think it is very interesting because this is a poster from the youth desk, quindi people of your age, of a party that we know quite well, that is the Lega Nord. E vedete, I think that somehow this poster sums up all that I want to say, because here they say, perché a noi le donne piacciono senza il velo. That's the way we like women, without the veil. But you can immediately see the crossing, if you want, of the colonialist glance, also with the gender dimension. That's the way we like women, that's the way I like that's the way I like my spritz with Campari. This is even more interesting. Guardate, if this is freedom, tomorrow let's forbid entrance with burqa to the end of Ramzan, to Eid, to the celebration of the end of Ramzan. And this is a politician from the right, Daniela Santanchè, and in a moment I'm actually going to say also how a part of the Italian right is instrumentalizing the donna musulmana in view of their own political gain. Allora, vedete, this is Daniela Santanchè in one of the many TV shows that somehow saw her, and here I would like to take, in fact, this Italian politician, Santanchè, as a symbol of a certain center-right that has adopted a quote-unquote feminist discourse. And here, as you can see, this is even more interesting. This is very recent. This is a poster that is very recent. Now, it so happens that you live in Florence, as you might have come to understand in those months that you've been here, obviously Florence is the perfect place in the world, as I've always been explaining in my classes. Quindi you don't see so much of that. But if you travel north or in the northeast of Italy, this is what you see basically on every wall. Quindi here in Florence, we are not so exposed to these kinds of images, but there are parts of Italy in which this is part, let's say, of the urban decor. You would see a lot of that. What does this image mean? It means now or never, stop Islamic invasion, and it is extremely important that, as a matter of fact, the Islamic invasion is represented as a woman in a burqa. You all know this, because this is old. This is an old cover of Time, but I think I mean it, I need it. Vedete, here it's another Italian leader that was quoted exactly this morning, Matteo Salvini. Vedete, in synthesis here, I do not have the time to translate, but it is a very, very popular post of this leader, Matteo Salvini, that in fact is using the facts of Cologne as a demonstration that it is impossible to integrate Islam into a democracy. This is essentially the political juice that is at the end of this presentation. Defending women comes cheap and chic. What do I try to say by cheap and chic? I try to say that the instrumentalization of the creation of a ghost of the donna musulmana as a victim of violence, as the denier, as the donna musulmana is never really given at least the benefit of the doubt of being capable of agency, is always seen as the symbol of all that Islam is, especially in the perception of the Europeans, is taken exactly as the symbol of this identity fight. I say it comes cheap and chic. And why? Because essentially it comes very easy, it comes very cheap, and it comes very chic to defend Muslim women when we first create a ghost of them. It comes very easy not to look at the reality. It comes very easy to create the stereotype of a victim that needs to be defended by whom? By us, the white feminists. As though our Western democracies didn't have any issue with gender justice, as though our Western democracies were still not featuring incredible percentages of women in leadership posts, as though, to begin from my own country, as though, to begin from my own democracy, the basic rate of women victims of domestic violence, not immigrants, not Muslim, purebred Italian, is 1 every 3 days. This is why defending Muslim women, defending with 4 quotation marks, please do not misunderstand me, comes cheap and chic, because it's a very easy way to see how much gender justice is still looking for real solution in our democracies.